Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a warm virtual welcome to the Habibie Center. Last month, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made history as the first official representative of her rank to visit Taiwan after almost 3 decades. In response to this, China carried out various actions both militarily and economically. For instance, China deployed conventional missiles, ships, and fighter jets to besiege Taiwan. In addition, the PLA also undertook military operations and long-range shooting exercises around Taiwan. Moreover, China imposed economic sanctions on more than 100 items of Taiwan products exported to China and an entry ban on 7 Taiwanese officials. Regarding the U.S.-Taiwan relations, in the latest news, the U.S. also approved the potential sale of $1.1 billion in weapons to Taiwan, likely to worsen already a heightened tension between the U.S. and China. This announcement came as 2 Chinese fighter jets crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait. The rivalry between US and China has also created concern and could potentially endanger regional peace in ASEAN region. During the ministerial meeting in Cambodia, ASEAN leaders tried to de-escalate the tension by stating that ASEAN should act together to play a constructive role in facilitating all parties. With rising tension between China and the US related to Taiwan issue, however, questions arise over the possible scenario should China invade Taiwan and what roles ASEAN can play in a Taiwan conflict. Therefore, to discuss this issue more deeply, we are highly pleased to have 3 distinguished speakers joining us today. First, I'd like to welcome Mr. Malcolm Davis. He's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Second, we have Mr. Drew Thompson, who is a visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And last but not least, we have Mr. Benjamin Ho, an assistant professor at the China program, Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Good morning, Mr. Davis, Mr. Thompson, and Mr. Ho. Thank you very much for your availability to join the webinar in the midst of your busy schedule. So with them, we will be discussing the recent tension in Taiwan Strait post-Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and the potential implications of the China-Taiwan tension to the ASEAN member states. Additionally, we also would like to explore the potential role of ASEAN in facilitating peaceful dialogue between China and Taiwan. This webinar will be divided into 2 sessions. First is the presentation from the speakers with 15 until 20 minutes allocated time respectively. The first speaker will be Mr. Davis, followed by Mr. Thompson and Mr. Ho. After the presentation are delivered, we will move on to the Q&A session. And during the Q&A session, the audience can ask questions or give comments on the YouTube live chat feature. Without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Malcolm Davis. As I mentioned earlier, he's a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability, Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Prior to this, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in China-Western Relations at Bonn University. He holds a PhD in strategic studies from the University of Hull, as well as 2 master degrees in strategic studies. His main research focus is on defense strategy and capability development, military technology, and the future of warfare. In this webinar, Mr. Davis will share the significance of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan on the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and the U.S. response to China's military drill near Taiwan from the Australian perspective. Mr. Davis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with you all. What I'll do is I'll talk about the implications of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, why it was so contentious, and potential how it could shape both China's actions in coming years and US and allied responses. I want to bring in an allied perspective as much as possible, because it's not just about the US, obviously, in the Indo-Pacific, and in particular in relation to the Taiwan crisis. And at the end of the obviously session, I'm happy to sort of answer questions when we go into the Q&A. So firstly, the significance of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan on US Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it needs to be seen very much in the broader context of intensifying strategic competition between a rising China and the United States. Essentially, people talk about the Thucydides trap, where you have a rising power challenging an existing power, leading to competition and ultimately conflict. I think we're seeing the potential for that emerging in the Indo-Pacific today, and Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint for such a conflict to occur. And there's been various discussions about how this might evolve, how this might eventuate. Timelines for such a crisis range from second half of this decade into the early 2030s. It's very clear that China under Xi is becoming far more assertive in the Indo-Pacific region. It's challenging its strategic interests of the United States and its allies. So we're asking the question of, what does China want? I think it's very clear that what China wants is an end to US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific, and a desire to push the US presence and influence out of the Western Pacific and Eastern Asia as a step towards establishing a Chinese sphere of influence, what it calls the community of common destiny. Ultimately, that all contributes towards achieving a China dream no later than 2049 that would essentially see the return of the dominance of China, both regionally and globally. Part of that process is, of course, forcing unification of Taiwan with China. It's an essential step from Xi's perspective. Xi is determined very much to get Taiwan into China. China obviously regards Taiwan as a wayward province, part of China. But it's important to state that the vast majority of Taiwanese do not see themselves as Chinese or part of China. And they seek to maintain the status quo rather than accept what is often called the 1992 consensus, leading to unification on China's terms. And I think importantly, they see the examples of Xinjiang, Tibet, and most recently Hong Kong as grounds for not pursuing unification with China. So with this background context out there, I think Pelosi's visit to Taiwan reinforced US support for Taiwan as a liberal democracy and as an alternative model for governance and growth that is presented to the Chinese people, an alternative to that promoted by the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. And I think Pelosi's appropriateness of strategic ambiguity as this attack, liberal democracy of 23.5 million people that has a vibrant and growing market economy. So when we think about the challenge by an authoritarian China, we have to ask ourselves the question, can we accept the forcible annexation of 3.5 million people into an authoritarian China against their will, or do we support their right to self-determination as a liberal democracy and a free and open society, even if that means with the risk of war with China? And I think that Pelosi's visit to Taipei, Indonesia, is a liberal democracy that is a free and open society. And so we have to think about how we support Taiwan's freedom to choose its own path. The United States recognizes one China, like Australia does, a one China principle, okay? So the US-China policy, like the Australian-China policy, calls for a peaceful China to Taiwan, differentiate a policy like the US maintains against China's one China principle, which says that Taiwan is part of China. And so this creates the potential for conflict to emerge in the future, because China is determined to take Taiwan as part of China. The US has maintained a posture of strategic ambiguity. That was very useful in the past when China lacked the means or the immediate intent to take Taiwan by force. But I'd argue increasingly those factors are receding. Under Xi, China has demonstrated an intent to use force to take Taiwan, either coercively through grey zone actions, the sort of things you see where China might threaten to take offshore territories or undertake an economic blockade, or even the missile drills around Taiwan after the Pelosi visit could be seen as grey zone actions, or directly through a cross-straits invasion, and has made it clear that China will not, as to what it does mean, all necessary means, you can use your imagination. So he's making it very clear there that China does intend to use force if necessary to take Taiwan. And given that the vast majority of the Taiwanese people do not seek unification with China, it's becoming more and more likely, in my opinion, that China will use force to take Taiwan either later this decade or sometime early in the next decade. They're also developing the means to actually do this. Previously, they have not had the actual military capability to do this, but estimates put PLA modernization on track to probably be able to undertake a cross-straits invasion by about 2026, 2027, which with 2027, I think, being the 100th anniversary of the formation of the PLA. So you can, I think, read all sorts of signals into that. So I think Pelosi's visit highlights a real challenge for the current Biden administration and also for any future administration after 2024 of asking this question: does strategic ambiguity best serve the requirement for effective deterrence of an attack by China on Taiwan? Or is it time to move beyond strategic ambiguity and more directly declare its willingness to defend Taiwan as a means to deter that Chinese attack? I think the case for the case for defending Taiwan is very strong, and the implications of China annexing Taiwan, either as a result of the US choosing not to intervene or as a result of a failed intervention, would be devastating for US influence in the Indo-Pacific and for the future of a free and open Indo-Pacific in general. So I think the case is strong, and I think that Pelosi's visit to Taiwan reinforces the case that it is time to move beyond strategic ambiguity. And I'm hearing more and more chatter that one of the issues that will be center in the upcoming US congressional midterms and then in 2024 is this issue of strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan and whether the US should move beyond Taiwan. I think the case for moving beyond that is correct if it's done in a manner that reinforces deterrence against China and reinforces the case to Beijing that the US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific will not accept Chinese use of force against Taiwan. At the same time, however, it opens up a window for the US and its allies to proactively provide greater assistance to Taiwan and build closer relations, once again, to reinforce deterrence against any future Chinese invasion or the use of Chinese grey zone threats. I think if strategic ambiguity is maintained into the future as a basis for continued vague policy as to whether the US would or would not intervene, that actually weakens deterrence against China and makes it more likely that China would then be tempted to use force sometime later this decade. So the bottom line in regards to Pelosi's visit, I think, is it has thrown up an issue that previously was assumed would be essentially static, that is strategic ambiguity. It creates a window of opportunity for the US and its allies to build greater multilateral ties and enmesh Taiwan within a free and open Indo-Pacific. That makes it more difficult for China to use force to try and annex Taiwan. And that, in other words, it strengthens deterrence. And that is a good thing, in my opinion. Turning to the question of the US response to China's military drills near Taiwan after Pelosi's visit, I think that the immediate response was quite muted. The US did not respond militarily. They kept the military away from the region, unlike the previous Taiwan Straits crisis of 96-97, when the Clinton administration dispatched carrier battle groups. This time in 2022, the Biden administration chose not to do that because I think that the Biden administration recognized that the PLA, and by that I mean the PLA Navy and Air Force and so forth, is far more capable in 2022 than what it was in 1996-97. So you saw a diplomatic response, but intense discussion, I think, within Washington, D.C. about the whole issue of strategic ambiguity and how do we respond to future Chinese challenges. From the Beijing's perspective, I think they saw the Pelosi visit as opportunistic to change conditions around Taiwan, to normalize Chinese use of force in a manner that makes it easier for Beijing to choose escalation in any future cross-straits invasion. Unfortunately, therefore, one of the side effects of the Pelosi visit, as good intentioned as it was to give Beijing the opportunity to change the military dynamics around Taiwan in its favor and practice the types of military activities that would occur during a coercive phase of any operation to seize Taiwan in the future, including, for example, a blockade. So you've seen China establish a new precedent for its military activities that builds on air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and expand those across the median line, though not yet directly into Taiwanese airspace, at least with aircraft. You did see missiles overflying Taiwanese territory. China continues to challenge the limits with drone overflights of Taiwanese offshore territories such as Kinmen. And now Taiwan has responded by shooting down one of the drones after taking a series of measures to warn off the Chinese. I think the Biden administration response to these developments so far has been fairly muted. But as I said, there's those internal discussions that I'm sure are underway within the administration. And most significantly, I think, has been that $1.1 billion arms package that includes Harpoon anti-ship missiles. And more significant, I think, is the declaration by the Biden administration that Taiwan is a major non-NATO ally. That will make it easier for the US and indeed others to provide arms to Taiwan in the future. So I think the key issue facing the Biden administration now and any post-2024 administration, whether it's another Biden administration or a Republican administration, is how best to reinforce Taiwan's ability to undertake deterrence by denial through proactively providing further defense capabilities designed to raise the potential cost of any Chinese cross-straits invasion to unacceptable levels, and whether to amend or scrap strategic ambiguity as the basis for US policy towards Taiwan. Furthermore, I think the US must work with its partners in the Indo-Pacific, notably Australia, Japan, South Korea, India, and the ASEAN states, for a more coherent posture towards Taiwan and to reinforce deterrence against any move by China to use force against Taiwan. I think the goal should be deterrence of China, but recognizing that deterrence may fail, we need to develop closer partnerships between the US and its allies, undertaking joint exercises to better prepare the US and its allies for any possible decision on intervention in any crisis. And this brings us to the most important challenge that we all face, looking forward into the future of this decade and beyond. If the US and its allies do decide to intervene to defeat any Chinese cross-straits use of force in a cross-straits crisis, what does that conflict look like? What are the US goals? Is there a US theory of victory for conflict with China over Taiwan? And what do the US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific need to do to prepare for such a conflict? Those are some pretty big questions that we need to start grappling with rather than assuming that such a conflict wouldn't happen. I'll stop there and happy to take questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Davis, for your comprehensive presentation. I noted some point that you mentioned, China is more assertive under this administration and more concerned with unification to get Taiwan into China's part. In contrast, the majority of Taiwanese want to remain in the current status quo. And for the U.S. Foreign policy toward Taiwan issue, the U.S. acknowledges the one China policy, but it's not necessarily accepting and supporting this policy. And the U.S. also applies strategic ambiguity in terms of the Taiwan issue to deter China. Now, I would like to invite the second speaker, Mr. Drew Thompson. He's a visiting senior research fellow in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He was previously the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Additionally, he also served as the Director of China Studies and Star Senior Fellow at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. Mr. Thompson obtained his master's in government from Johns Hopkins University and bachelor's in ASEAN Studies from Hobart College. His research interests are in U.S.-China relations, China's relationship with neighboring states, and the U.S. foreign policy. In this session, Mr. Thompson will touch on why the Taiwan crisis matters to Southeast Asia from the U.S. perspective. Mr. Thompson, you have the floor. Sorry, Mr. Thompson, you're still unmute.
I'm sorry, I don't know who muted it. I thought you were in control of the mute. But thank you, Marina, for that very generous introduction and for having me on this very distinguished panel. So let me start by pointing out that I think Speaker Pelosi's visit should be seen as part of a continuum of U.S. support for Taiwan. And this is support that evolves and adapts to the changing nature of China's pressure and even aggression. And this support goes back to the beginning of the Cold War, and it goes back even beyond that to World War II, when the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek was facing an invasion from Japan. So U.S. support for Taiwan is longstanding, and Nancy Pelosi's visit is just one point on a very long timeline. But I think a key outcome of the Pelosi visit is really much greater awareness globally about the military pressure that China has employed against Taiwan for decades. So stepping back from that, I think it's also valuable to remind people here that the objective of U.S. cross-strait policy, and really the most essential element of that strategy, is to provide Taiwan with sufficient assurances, so that the Taiwanese themselves can negotiate a peaceful settlement with Beijing from a position of relative security. And I say relative, but essentially enabling the people of Taiwan to feel confident enough to reach an agreement with Beijing on the future settlement of their dispute that's satisfactory to the people on Taiwan. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, was on a television program yesterday, and he summed it up very, very succinctly and very explicitly. And he said, "We will continue to push back against any effort to change the status quo by force." So that's really the nub of U.S. interests and strategy. So this approach is driven by interests, but it's also driven by values. And some of my friends that I'm engaging with in Southeast Asia don't always understand why the U.S. does what it does with Taiwan. Why does it prioritize arms sales and straight transits and demonstrations of support and reassurance for Taiwan, like Speaker Pelosi's visit, when it engenders the kind of reaction that it does from Beijing? And they wonder, why the U.S. isn't more pragmatic and doesn't accommodate China more in an effort to reduce tension. So I think other people that I speak to also will sometimes blame the U.S. for antagonizing China, right? Including Pelosi's visit, arguing that her visit is the cause of these tensions. But I mean, I'd note that these tensions have been longstanding, multi-generational, and they're also part and parcel of essentially the largest military buildup since World War II that's occurred. China's military has undergone a 2-decade-long military expansion, and Taiwan has been the #1 focus of the PLA modernization effort. And China's defense spending has increased on an average 10% every year since about the last 20 years. And the annual increase this year is $28 billion. So that's really quite an astounding number. China's defense spending increased to $28 billion this year. Indonesia's total defense budget is $8 billion, just by comparison. Taiwan's this year, it's announced their defense spending is 19 million. It's probably closer to 15 at the end of the day, but it's still, China's increases is multiple times Indonesia's defense spending, Taiwan's defense spending, and far outstrips anyone else in the region's defense spending. So total defense spending, China's official statistic is $220 billion. So China is rapidly, massively increasing its capability to coerce Taiwan militarily. As Dr. Davis pointed out, the Australian ambassador recently implied that all options were on the table, and you could use your imagination to figure out what he means by that. But you actually don't have to use your imagination. You can just look at China's white paper on Taiwan that was issued last month, which is explicit about the use of force to resolve the political difference between the two sides. So I think the use of force, the use of military force to enable unification, if peaceful means can't accomplish it, is really an explicit policy in Beijing. So you have growing capabilities, a stated intention to use force to settle the political dispute, and furthermore, you have Beijing willing to use all forms of coercion, diplomatic, economic, informational, as well as military. And that compels the US to respond, and it responds in the form of additional reassurance to Taiwan. And arms sales to Taiwan, straight transits, these are very visible parts of that reassurance effort, as is Pelosi's visit. And remember, from congressional perspective, and one more thing to remember is that Taiwan is a bipartisan issue in Washington. Both the Republicans and the Democrats strongly support Taiwan. So Congress has fewer tools to reassure Taiwan. One of them is visits, and the other is legislation. And that's the other big agenda item now in Washington is Congress working on a new Taiwan Policy Act. So even though those activities antagonize Beijing, political forces in Washington are more than willing to manage that friction, to further their interests and reassure Taiwan. I think it's also important that the US is signaling its resolve to stand up to China, not just for Taiwan, but also as a signal to US allies. As Dr. Davis points out, as much of what the US is doing is not just related to Taiwan, but to its entire alliance network. So I think the other aspect of Pelosi's visits that's significant was that China's response was quite military, and certainly the most visible part was military. There were, of course, economic sanctions as well. There were other diplomatic efforts, but those were actually, I would say, argue smaller in scale than the military demonstrations. And I think that really hit home for people in Southeast Asia, the military dynamic of China's coercive campaign. I think longtime PLA watchers know that China regularly exercises its military all year long, but particularly during the summer. It conducts amphibious exercises. It launches ballistic missiles, not regularly over and beyond Taiwan, but certainly in its own territory and sometimes into the South China Sea, as we saw 2 years ago. So military exercises are a regular part of China's signaling. And it's also worth noting that military exercises are frequently scheduled over the summer. And that's partly because of good weather windows, but also because of the conscription cycle. Summer exercises are a capstone activity before conscripts are demobilized in the fall. So much of the activities that I think occurred in China at the time of the Pelosi visit in August were regular summer activities that the PLA would undertake anyway, regardless of if she had gone. What changed was China's signaling, messaging, and propaganda around them. Again, it's worth noting that flights into Taiwan's ADIZ are a daily occurrence that goes back almost 10 years. The first flights to the center line of the Taiwan Strait were in 1999 when China was unhappy with Li Tenghui. China's been conducting bomber flights around Taiwan since 2016, and its aircraft carriers have been exercising around Taiwan, both off its west coast in the Strait and off its east coast in the Western Pacific, basically since the Liaoning was launched in 2012. I believe its first Strait transit was in 2013. So I think all of that's important context to understand why and how the US is responding to coercion and pressure that China's putting on Taiwan, because again, the strategy is to give Taiwan a sense of security so they can negotiate a peaceful resolution with China without coercion. So why does this matter to Southeast Asia and Southeast Asians? So I think Southeast Asian states have pretty considerable interest in Taiwan, as well as a real underlying interest in preventing the use of force to settle disputes in the region. Unfortunately, Southeast Asian states, I think, have really been unwilling to exert political capital to preserve those interests. And this is understandable because they have conflicting interests with China. They have economic interests, and of course, the interests of not being pummeled by Beijing if they were to attempt to stand up to China. And those punishments from China, should they oppose China's positions, would probably far exceed the benefits they would gain from standing up to Taiwan. So the way I look at Southeast Asian interests and the risks that they face is effectively political, economic, and security risks. And should cross-strait tensions reach the point of armed conflict, those risks greatly increase. So I think political and economic interests are pretty well intertwined. But most importantly, from a political perspective, the use of force to settle political disputes is clearly inconsistent with the interests of Southeast Asian states. It's against Southeast Asian states' values. It gets right to the heart of ASEAN's purpose, the principles in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and also the 2002 Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, all of which call for peaceful settlement of disputes and not use of force. Another key political factor, of course, is Taiwan's geopolitical location, setting aside critical sea lanes that connect both the East and the South China Seas. And just as the South China Sea is geostrategically important, connecting the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, Taiwan sits astride the same critical trade routes that connect Northeast Asian economies with Southeast Asia. On an economic level, Taiwan is quite important. It's the 23rd largest economy in the world. It's a critical link in global supply chains. It's a significant trading partner with and an investor in Southeast Asian states. If Taiwan were a member of ASEAN, it would be the second largest economy after Indonesia. On a per capita basis, Taiwan would be the second largest after Singapore. So Taiwan is economically significant, and a conflict over Taiwan would disrupt those business relationships. It would disrupt the commercial sea lanes that supply and fuel economic growth in Southeast Asia. Directly, it would impose significant costs on commerce, transport costs, insurance. It would create probably shortages, wide-scale inflation, and general economic uncertainty. And again, the political economic dynamic really crosses paths in the issue of migrant workers. So Taiwan Ministry of Labor noted that before COVID, there were over about 720,000 workers from Southeast Asian states living in Taiwan, and mostly from Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So as Taiwan's economy grows, as the post-COVID economies open up, that number is likely going to return and probably increase. Keeping in mind, Taiwan has very low birth rates, so its population is shrinking, and it's going to become increasingly reliant on foreign labor. So having over 700,000 Southeast Asian citizens living and working in Taiwan has pretty significant implications in the case of a conflict. Obviously, the potential loss of incomes, remittances back to home countries, and of course, the physical threat to citizens of Southeast Asian states who might find themselves in a war zone and in a very, very contested environment that would make evacuation potentially difficult. So you've got pretty significant political risks. You've got significant economic risks, and you also have, major security risks. I think the theater of war, should a cross-strait conflict occur, would undoubtedly encompass the territory of Southeast Asian states. The 6 exercise zones that were announced by China at the beginning of the Pelosi visit, which, by the way, did restrict freedom of navigation for commercial ships, also included the economic zones of Japan and the Philippines. And the southeast zone that was closest to the Philippines was only 22 nautical miles from the closest Philippine island, which is only 10 miles from Philippines' territorial waters. So if that gives an indication of how close the theater of conflict would be to the Philippines, to other parts of particularly contested territories in the South China Sea, I think it's pretty clear that a military conflict over Taiwan will not just take place in the area adjacent to ASEAN, but it will spill over and encompass the ASEAN states. Again, also worth noting that I mentioned that China launched 4 ballistic missiles into the South China Sea in the vicinity of the Paracels in August 2020. I don't think ASEAN responded loudly or forcibly at all, if they even acknowledged it, which again is, I think, an indication of the reluctance of Southeast Asian states to stand up to China, even when their own interests are being impinged upon. So I guess the question is, does ASEAN, play a role? And I think that was the question you put to us when you asked me to join the panel. And for the most part, Southeast Asian states have chosen not to play a role. Southeast Asian policy positions when it comes to US-China competition are often articulated as negatives, what they will not do, right? They will not choose sides, or they will not interfere. And I think that's their right, and that is a form of agency. But it's clear that Southeast Asian states simply don't want it to happen, and they'd rather it doesn't happen. But without a more proactive, positive agenda, rather than a passive one, calling on all sides to refrain or reduce tensions is not going to be impactful or influential. So the question is, can ASEAN be more influential? And I think up to this point, it hasn't. And that doesn't necessarily negate ASEAN centrality. And I don't think it should be. And I think there's a temptation, particularly in the US, to confuse ASEAN centrality with a notion of some form of dominance or exertion of authority. And I don't think that's the case, but it's a misperception that probably ASEAN could work on articulating a little better for foreign partners, is what ASEAN's limits would be, but also what their affirmative policies would be. So, I mean, again, it's quite clear that ASEAN is not intent on enforcing the principles contained in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, for example. I mean, Article 2 is pretty explicit about renouncing the use of force, but the use of force is very much on the table. But that said, and I'll start to wrap up, we're not yet at the conflict stage, but that doesn't mean that nobody's paying attention. I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong mentioned in his National Day speech last month that they are watching very, very closely. But I think other countries will also be watching, and the citizens of Southeast Asia will also be watching, not just to see that their capitals are watching, but that they're actually doing something. I thought I'll wrap up with just a quick thought on strategic ambiguity, since Dr. Davis raised it, and I think it's a really good point. I'm not sure that ending strategic ambiguity would necessarily change Beijing's calculation, nor would it help US positioning. I think China already presumes that the US will intervene militarily. I think that's partly what Nancy Pelosi's visit does, is assures Beijing that the US will support Taiwan in the face of pressure. I would argue also that strategic ambiguity has served the US pretty well. And another aspect is it's not just about deterring Beijing. There's many tools to do that, but it's also about managing Taiwan. Strategic ambiguity ensures that Taiwan doesn't revert to populism. As you noted, and I think Benjamin may raise this in his remarks, Taiwan public opinion very much leans towards independence. They support the status quo, but increasingly the status quo now, but independence later. And that concerns Beijing, right? Taiwan identity is shifting. A majority of people no longer self-identify as ethnic Chinese, but as Taiwanese, a very unique identity that doesn't serve the purposes of Beijing towards peaceful unification. So by ensuring that there's a little bit of ambiguity in Taipei's mind, or at least the notion that U.S. support is conditioned on Taiwan not antagonizing Beijing, then I think strategic ambiguity is very valuable. Another aspect of strategic ambiguity is ensuring that Taiwan adequately spends for its own defense, and this has been a problem from as far as I can remember, going back to the 1990s up until about 2015-16, Taiwan defense spending was flat at $10 billion a year with no increases. And despite the growing threat and the growing capabilities of the PLA, there was no political appetite in Taiwan to spend more on its defense. And having Taiwan turn itself into a porcupine, be able to hold off and deter Beijing itself is really critical. But if the U.S. is unambiguous about its support, effectively giving Taiwan a blank check, then they will be tempted to continue to underfund their defense. They'll be tempted to be more populist and perhaps antagonize Beijing without fear of consequences because of this unambiguous support. But I think to Dr. Davis's point, and he makes a very good one, that if strategic clarity is a tool to gain greater support from U.S. allies, then that's probably a pretty powerful argument for it. But to do that for the U.S., for Washington, it would need to have an element of conditionality so that the U.S. doesn't get dragged into a conflict unwillingly by Taiwan. And you also mentioned the Peloponnesian Wars. And it wasn't just between Athens and Sparta. It was really stimulated by Persia and Thebes. I mean, the risk isn't that the two superpowers get into conflict. The risk is that the allies of the superpowers drag them into conflict. And I think that's what strategic ambiguity manages. It ensures that Taiwan doesn't sleepwalk into a conflict, dragging the U.S. into it. So I'll stop there and look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for the insightful presentation. I highlighted some important points. The first one is that the Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is part of the continuation of the U.S. support to Taiwan that evolved from year to year. You also explained the comparison of defense spending of China and Taiwan. And post Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China's response in the form of military demonstration is more significant rather than the economic sanctions. Lastly, in the context of the Southeast Asia region, the political, economic interest and risk of ASEAN countries influence the way ASEAN views cross-strait relations. Thank you once again, Mr. Thompson. Before I turn to the next speaker, I would like to gently remind our audience on YouTube that you can write down your questions or comments on the live chat feature. I'll read them out to the speakers later during the Q&A session. Now I would like to invite our last speaker, Mr. Benjamin Ho. As I mentioned previously, he is currently serving as an assistant professor at the China program, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. He earned his PhD from the Department of International Relations at DLSE, UK. His research focus includes the study of China's international relations and security multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific. In this forum, Mr. Ho will present the ASEAN member states' stance on the fluid development of China-Taiwan tension in the Indo-Pacific region and ASEAN potential roles in facilitating a peaceful dialogue between China and Taiwan. Mr. Ho, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Marina. Can you guys see the slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much once again for this invitation to share some of my thoughts on assessing the impact of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the role of ASEAN on cross-strait relations. Being the final speaker, I'm aware that there are a lot of very good content that has earlier been presented by both Malcolm and Drew. So and I'm definitely looking forward to the robust discussion later on. Two key questions that Marina provided to me to address. One is to assess ASEAN member states' stance on the development of China-Taiwan tension in the Indo-Pacific region. And the second question would be the ASEAN potential roles in facilitating peaceful dialogue between China and Taiwan.
Sorry, Mr. Ho.
Yes.
Could you please make the full screen?
Full screen, okay. Just hang on. Is it full screen? You see it full screen?
Not yet.
Not yet, because it's full screen on my screen.
Oh.
Yeah. Shall I try it? Let me just try it
yes,
again.
Yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, can you see it? Is it full screen?
Wait a moment. Oh, no.
Yeah, not full screen?
Yeah.
Would it be okay if I just carry on? Would it be a problem on your end?
Yeah, you can go ahead, please.
Can I go ahead? Okay. So what I did, to the first question, assessing ASEAN member state stance, it's difficult to assess the sort of official stance per se of all 10 ASEAN countries. But what I tried and do is essentially to look at the newspaper headlines in the subsequent 1 or 2 days after Pelosi's visit. Again, because these papers are in English, these are the English versions. I would not say this is a very accurate depiction of the position, but nonetheless, at least from the news perspective, and I suppose copy editors would take some liberty with framing some of these positions. But from what I gathered, so these are the 10 ASEAN countries, and these were the headlines that were mentioned in their respective national papers subsequently after the visit. So from my color code, what we can see is at least for 6 ASEAN countries: Brunei, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Generally, it's neutral, essentially highlighting it as it is. Whereas for 4 countries, namely Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos, you could tell that there is a certainly much more forceful headline in response to Pelosi's visit. Interestingly, none of these headlines actually spoke well of the visit. So that's something that, and this is again an extension of what Drew mentioned earlier, that Southeast Asian countries, by and large, are unwilling to view Pelosi's visit as a good thing. The headlines in the Singapore Straits Times, for instance, talk about that it was unnecessary, failed to serve any strategic goal. Indonesia calling for de-escalation. So I think by and large in Southeast Asia, the visit was viewed in a neutral, or in fact, in some countries as a negative, in a negative mode. What was ASEAN's official response? So if you look at the joint communique of the 55th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, which happened during the time of Pelosi's visit, there was no mention of cross-strait relations. One assessment from a scholar puts it that way: owing to the sensitivity of the issue, ASEAN governments did not mention by name Pelosi's visit to Taiwan or China in their statement. Instead, they sort of frame the issue, cross-strait relations, in a much more ambiguous tone, basically emphasizing the need for cooperation, peaceful coexistence, stability, and security. The Singapore MFA statement was a little more, it highlighted cross-strait relations and that the fact that ASEAN ministers view these developments with concern. I did not have the opportunity to look at the statements from other ASEAN countries, either because it was not out there in their respective MFA websites or I wasn't able to find it. But in short, one could adduce from these illustrations that ASEAN does not, that Pelosi's visit was viewed as broadly unnecessary, that there was very little strategic impetus beyond US own domestic calculations for visiting, and that it was not in Southeast Asia interest, broadly speaking, to have Pelosi visit Taiwan in this period. And this brings back to ASEAN's dilemma. Again, this has been mentioned earlier by Drew, and I would say this dilemma is really at the heart of the whole problem. When regional security and internal security clash, it is so for most ASEAN countries and for many countries around the world, this is viewed as fundamentally an issue of China's internal matters. I note the point earlier that was mentioned that the United States acknowledges the one China policy but does not accept it. But for most countries, this is viewed as China in internal matters. So they are unwilling to get involved since it's China's internal matters. But on the other hand, and this was again rightly pointed out, whatever happens in and around the Taiwan Straits is not purely a domestic China's issue, but it's also a matter of regional security. And that is why, as the Singapore MFA statement alluded to, ASEAN ministers certainly have reasons to view it with concern. The second point I want to highlight is to what extent is the principle of non-interference being adhered to? And this is almost a sacrosanct principle in ASEAN countries' relations with one another. We do not want to get involved or to be viewed as being interfering or being interfered, or that our own domestic politics are being interfered. So to what extent is this principle of being adhered to within this broader dilemma? Again, as was pointed out, China is ASEAN's biggest trading partner, and there are economic costs in challenging and displeasing Beijing. And I'm sure many of our leaders have factored that into their own calculation in choosing to respond or not to respond. Of course, it raises the whole issue of also America's strategic interests. Singapore former top diplomat, Ambassador Corsican, said there are more intelligent ways to give Taiwan the support it needs. So the question also is, how do America's strategic interests come into play with regards to the cross-strait relations? However, and this is something that we need to note, that China's sort of show of force in response to Pelosi's visit was also very telling. And one might say that it's an overreaction to the US not so strategic eye-poking. So this is something that I believe many political observers and leaders have noticed. Indeed, if the United States, and right now, as China responds in such a forceful manner, the irony is that it has not deterred the United States or even European countries from visiting Taiwan. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, countries in the West and the United States have continued to demonstrate that kind of support to Taiwan, regardless of what the Chinese did. So I think this is also quite illuminating. If a visit by a House Speaker could result in such a response, then clearly it also demonstrates certain sort of weaknesses within Chinese own political calculation, and which could be very much taken advantage of. So the big question, as Marina posed me, so where does this leave ASEAN? There are at least 3 potential scenarios that I foresee moving forward in regards to cross-strait relations. The best case scenario for ASEAN, in my view, is certainly a return to a pre-Pelosi visit status quo, which would give ASEAN the most room for maneuver. The new normal, however, as people have already pointed out, is that we will see increased diplomatic exchanges, especially from Western countries, followed by increased and assertive Chinese challenge. So this would be something problematic. It is certainly by no means the worst case scenario, but and certainly China would have to be very careful that it does not overcommit its forces simply in response to parliamentary visits from other countries. What does that mean from ASEAN? In my view, ASEAN would have to tread carefully to ensure that it does not fall under China's diplomatic control. So what the Chinese would like to do is certainly to sort of push ASEAN to take key positions or to take explicit sides. And this is where ASEAN would have to tread carefully. The Chinese, I don't think the Chinese view this responding to Western visits to Taiwan simply as an own issue. It would want to get ASEAN countries to be involved, and certainly framing it in the case of that this is a case of interference into domestic politics, which is very much part of what ASEAN own calculations. It would want ASEAN to sort of make that statement saying that such visits are wrong, but ASEAN would have to tread very carefully to ensure it does not fall under China's diplomatic control or even coercion. Of course, the worst case scenario is that China attempts to take Taiwan, and most likely, as we have mentioned earlier, most likely it wouldn't be in a peaceful manner. And America's possible responses would also result in, so there are three responses from the US. One is to retreat in the face of Chinese trying to retake Taiwan. One is to support Taiwan, but not at the front lines. Essentially, it's providing military, providing moral support. And the third, of course, would be to defend Taiwan. And this is where, in the worst case scenario, ASEAN would have to choose between the US and China. And US and China, no second. There is almost no middle ground in this, if such a scenario were to emerge. So is there a fourth option? And this is the question that was posed to me, facilitating peaceful dialogue. My answer, of course, is yes, but in my view, it is unlikely to materialize at the ASEAN 10 countries level. There is a possibility of an ASEAN minus approach, but that would undercut ASEAN years of regional building and calibrated multilateralism. In other words, it will call into question ASEAN's project over the last 50 years about regional building. But the fact is that you're not going to get all 10 countries in ASEAN seeing eye to eye in the matter. One idea that I've been thinking about is that we might need to move beyond saying about ASEAN being in the driver's seat to talking about ASEAN as the pivot point. And this is where I would highlight earlier. In the driver's seat, ASEAN leaders have often talked about the issue of ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN essentially sets the agenda. But increasingly, it would seem that either the agenda that is set and that is being explicated in ASEAN meetings are irrelevant to the real issues out there, or that the real agenda is not being set by ASEAN, but is being set and driven by the major powers. So one way to move beyond seeing ASEAN in the driver's seat is to look at ASEAN as the pivot point, where instead of talking about ASEAN centrality, perhaps it might be useful to go beyond centrality to look at credibility. So in other words, rather than stressing ASEAN being the central role, Southeast Asia should and could focus on building credibility, both separately, individually as individual countries, and also collectively as a multilateral institution. And what do I mean by credibility? In my own reading, it means not being overly dependent on any major power. In other words, what is at stake for ASEAN and Southeast Asia, not just in terms of cross-strait relations, but even in our relations with China and the United States, is about the extent of which we are able to make free choices without having to choose exclusively among the two powers. So this brings me to my final point. And that is, firstly, I do not view a single ASEAN position or one-size-fits-all solution to cross-strait relations. Every individual country would have to calculate for themselves what would be their best response, and they will have to decide how best to position themselves in this tussle for regional influence. The other question would be: would a unified China, in this case Taiwan and the mainland unification, would it be a boon or bane for Southeast Asia? It's unclear. I'm not sure whether studies have been done on this to see whether a unified China would be a good thing for Southeast Asia, or it will generate more anxieties on the part of Southeast Asia. Of course, the role of the United States and its allies would be of crucial importance for Southeast Asia, and how would they decide? And last but not least, what would be needed for ASEAN to enhance its credibility on the international stage. So finally, I use this this diagram of what we talk about ASEAN as the pivot point. So if we consider that ASEAN's interests are best achieved when the United States and China have a sort of perfect balance of power, then by definition, any attempt by either of the superpower to gain greater weight or presence would mean that ASEAN countries would have to shift their positions tactically to the other side in order to ensure that the seesaw remains balanced. So I would say a lot of the calculations moving forward, if we assume that our interests are best served by having both countries being in equilibrium with one another, then any attempt, as it were, to change the status quo, be it in the South China Sea issue or be it in the cross-strait relations, would naturally mean that countries would have to gravitate to the other side to ensure that this equilibrium is met. So with that, I'll leave it to, I'll open this time for questions and answer. Thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ho, for your explanation. I noted some interesting points that you mentioned. You explained about 3 potential scenarios moving forward in regards to cross-strait relations. The best scenario would be return to pre-Pelosi visit status quo, and the second one is new normal, and the worst case is China attempts to retake Taiwan, most likely forcefully. Regarding the potential role of ASEAN in facilitating a peaceful dialogue between China and Taiwan, it is possible for ASEAN to do that, but unlikely to materialize at an ASEAN level. Thank you so much once again, Mr. Ho. Ladies and gentlemen, now we turn to the Q&A session. We have a few questions already from our participants, so I'll read them out to the speakers. The first question is from Greg in Jakarta to all speakers. He asked that some say that ASEAN statement on the cross-strait development doesn't reflect the bloc's full support to Beijing as China anticipated, given that it only reaffirms ASEAN member states' one China policy, but not clearly condemns Speaker Pelosi on her trip to Taiwan. Neither clearly recognizes China's claim over Taiwan. Do you agree with this observation? If yes, what is a reason behind that makes ASEAN fail to do so? If no, what is your own take on this statement? Maybe Mr. Davis, you want to go first, please?
I didn't quite catch the thrust of the question, so perhaps can you just say that again so I'm clear on what's being asked?
Okay. Some say that ASEAN statement on the cross-strait development doesn't reflect the bloc's full support to Beijing as China anticipated, given that it only reaffirms ASEAN member states' one China policy, but not clearly condemns Speaker Pelosi on her trip to Taiwan. Neither clearly recognizes China's claim over Taiwan. Do you agree with this observation? If yes, what is reason behind that makes ASEAN fail to do so? If no, what is your own take on this statement?
Well, look, I'm not familiar with the specific statement per se, but I think that we need to be cautious about automatically defaulting to China's stance regarding Taiwan, i.e. the one China principle. I think it's important that we maintain a policy, or ASEAN maintains an acceptance that there should be a peaceful resolution to the crisis without one side imposing its will on the other. And secondly, that any resolution has to meet the requirements of the Taiwanese people. So it's not about China essentially deciding for the Taiwanese people what their future is. And certainly the Chinese ambassador to Australia has basically said straight out that it is the Chinese people that will decide what Taiwan's future is, not the Taiwanese people. That to me is unacceptable. So I do think that ASEAN should maintain a fairly balanced approach on this, whereby it essentially echoes the US and Australia and says, look, let's have a peaceful resolution to the cross-straits crisis that takes into account and meets the needs of the Taiwanese people. I think that is the fairest solution for this crisis, rather than essentially saying, well, we accept the one China principle, so therefore China can do what it likes with the Taiwanese people. We are talking about, after all, 23.4 million people who's has a right to make their own choices about their own future. So that would be my stance. I'm not sure if it answered the question, but that's my posture.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Thompson, please. Mr. Thompson, sorry, you are still unmuted.
Sorry, you'd think after a few years we'd be good at unmuting by now. So I think on ASEAN's position as an organization, which I think generally, though not completely, reflects the position on a number of member states, any policy decision, any policy position is going to have benefits and costs, pros and cons. There's always going to be a trade-off, even if the decision is not to make a decision. And not choosing sides between the US and China definitely has its merits. And one of them is not being trampled on by Beijing, but there are also costs to that. And I think what the question was getting at is that there's risks to following a middle road. And by not choosing sides, ASEAN in particular risks alienating China by not meeting their expectations. Back in May, when I think there was a lot of discussions around engagements between President Xi Jinping and President Biden, and the Chinese ambassador in Washington reinforced essentially, his readout of the call, and he said explicitly that there is no room for compromise on the Taiwan issue from Beijing's perspective, which puts ASEAN in a really difficult position. It's either their way or the highway. And the problem is, if Beijing isn't willing to compromise, they're not willing to accept a middle ground, and they do risk being pressured into changing sides. So when I hear ASEAN colleagues, ASEAN analysts and Southeast Asian colleagues say that we don't want to choose sides, I think they're speaking to Beijing as much as they're speaking to Washington. But to Professor Ho's point, the consequences of inaction could result in a unified Taiwan and China, where Taiwan is not satisfied, where you run the risk of instability, basically an imperfect union that could destabilize the region even worse than the current status quo of high coercion, military, diplomatic, economic coercion by Beijing. And I think that has to be considered as a possible scenario. So the question ultimately is can Southeast Asian states afford to do nothing over time, or not? And I'd argue that preventing the use of force is in ASEAN's interest, even if that's going to entail spending some political capital and perhaps absorbing some costs for that, because I think the greater interest is in a more positive outcome. And again, to the point of the role of ASEAN as well, ASEAN, I think as it stands now, is really not, they're not an honest broker. And that's not just because of the relationship of several ASEAN states with China, but that is a factor. But it doesn't seek to be an honest broker. I'd question whether ASEAN has credibility on the Taiwan issue and whether it could be an honest broker in that respect. I mean, not being able to even mention the word Taiwan in a statement says something about its degree of commitment. ASEAN does have convening power, which it's always had, and I think maybe that's at the core of ASEAN centrality, is creating that space for external powers, both large and small, to convene. So I think that's a potential strength. But also, to Professor Ho's point, I think that for ASEAN to proactively foster a balance of power, whether that's restraining Beijing or shaping Washington, that would require an intervention. That would require some action on either individual states' part or on ASEAN as a group. And I think that's rather unlikely at this stage because of the stated preferences. I would note to sort of further Professor Ho's data set that Secretary of State Blinken was visiting the Philippines with its new government, and he met with President Marcos. And President Marcos actually had some pretty positive statements about Pelosi's visit and noted that that Chinese military coercion far predates her visit, and her visit was not a proximal cause of the tension. And he also noted that the visit was part of the US intention to reassure allies and partners. So I think in the view of different ASEAN states, Southeast Asian states, there are benefits to the US approach to Taiwan, which is centered on supporting allies and partners. So for maybe Philippines and Thailand, it means something very different than, say, Cambodia and Laos, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Ho, any comments?
Just a very brief comment, because I think both Malcolm and Drew did mention quite at length the question. I think my response is that why is there expectation for ASEAN to have full support towards Beijing? I think the question itself assumes that ASEAN countries need to support Beijing wholeheartedly. But as we all know, as scholars of ASEAN, ASEAN countries have very different positions with regards to China, and even our interests with China are very much different. So I would say the statement in the joint communique, it's something, I would say it's already reflective of a broader preference that Pelosi ought not to go to Taiwan. But it does not mean that therefore ASEAN countries would have to condemn the visit in its strongest terms so as to express full support towards Beijing. I think that would be really pushing ASEAN countries a bit too far, and to say, hey, if you're not with Beijing, if you're not expressing full support of Pelosi, if you're not condemning Pelosi's visit in the strongest terms, then you are not expressing full support to Beijing. I think that's a stretch of imagination to expect ASEAN countries to do so.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ho. I'll go to the next question from Chu. The question is, how do ASEAN countries support Taiwan when they have to align with basic principle of non-intervention upon internal, also in need if supporting for democratic and peaceful resolution way? Maybe I would like to invite Mr. Ho first.
The short answer is we support them under the radar and unofficially. Trade economics would be a very good way to start. Diplomatically, there's certainly you have a problem because the Chinese would block you. But there are many ways to express support without officially expressing support. So I would say it's not a matter, in this case, it's not a matter of non-interference, but I mean, Beijing doesn't usually call it that way unless it really wants, maybe in more recent times. But by and large, and for a long time, and I use the example of Singapore, when we established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China if I remember correctly, 3rd of October 1990, it was simply a one-liner saying that both the PRC and Singapore has decided to establish diplomatic relations. There was no mention of the issue of Taiwan at all. And you could argue that if then the Chinese leader was agreeable to establishing diplomatic relations with Singapore without any mention of the ROC or Taiwan, then why should it be a problem today? And the only reason why it is a problem today is because of certain political calculations in the PRC that Taiwan is an issue that somehow the status quo ought to be shifted in favor of Beijing. So I would say in short that Southeast Asia countries can continue to support Taiwan in their own manner. But of course, and this is where the challenge of whether the status quo, what then is the new status quo? Is China trying to move it? And if so, what would be the repercussions on Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Mr. Ho. Mr. Davis, please.
Yeah, look, I think Australia gives an example of how to do this. We have the One China policy, which means we recognise that the PRC as China. We acknowledge their claim to Taiwan, but that doesn't necessarily mean we support it. We have unofficial dealings with Taiwan that include trade, education, defence talks. We've had 1.5 track dialogues with the Taiwanese defence agencies, and academic exchanges, all of that. And we keep those at an unofficial level. Obviously, we can develop those to a degree as the relationship evolves. And I think that all of that can be done, as Benjamin was saying, under the radar without necessarily sort of needlessly and deliberately antagonizing Beijing. Now, Beijing can choose to be antagonized, but there's nothing we can do about their attitudes. But we, I think, set our foreign and defense policies for ourselves, not on the basis of what pleases Beijing. If it's in our interest to work with one of the most important democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, in the form of Taiwan, then we're going to do it. The real challenge, I think, comes further down the track when it becomes very clear that China is going to annex Taiwan against the wishes of the Taiwanese people. What is our stance then? And I think that's a discussion that has to be had, not just in Australia, but also in ASEAN and in the United States. How do we respond when China, irrespective of whatever we do, decides they are going to use force, as is quite likely in this decade? I think that to me is the key question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Thompson, please.
I agree with everything that's just been said. China has defined its position on interference in its internal affairs in pretty maximalist terms, which gives them tremendous latitude to apply pressure on other states when it suits them. As Dr. Davis said, they can choose when to be offended. And I think those unofficial relations that many other states have with Taiwan, despite the lack of diplomatic recognition, that's acceptable to Beijing under certain conditions, but Beijing is the one that determines those conditions. And that gets to this sort of elusive status quo that we all want to preserve. But the reality is that status quo is changing. The status quo is changing in terms of China's application of pressure. It's changing in terms of Taiwan public opinion and how that affects policy. There's no support in Taiwan for peaceful resolution under the terms currently being offered by Beijing. One country, two systems is completely unacceptable to both of the main political parties in Taiwan, including the Kuomintang, which is more favorable towards future unification, but not even under these terms. So I think maintaining the status quo is virtually impossible, particularly after the way that China has handled Hong Kong and the way it's essentially dismissed the basic law and the agreement to maintain the political system in Taiwan in Hong Kong for 50 years. So China's credibility as a partner to unify with is pretty much shot in Taiwan. So there's really nothing drawing the two sides together. And there's lots of interest external to Taiwan and China in maintaining positive, mutually beneficial relations unofficially with Taiwan. And I think that's what countries around the world are seeking to do. And that's partly a reflection of Taiwan's economy, the speciality and competitive advantages that they have, particularly in ICT, integrated circuits. They're a very dynamic economy, and I think that's an important draw for other countries pursuing their relations with Taiwan, pursuing their interest. And the problem is when that antagonizes Beijing, despite the longstanding practice, it presents even more challenges. So I also completely agree that the basic principle here is self-determination, and that's clearly central to Southeast Asian states' interests. So it's about that self-determination rather than non-interference that I think needs to dominate the discussion in Southeast Asia, because if use of force is acceptable to settle disputes, then I think you could look at the application of that problem in several other Southeast Asian disputes, and the values that ASEAN states espouse are simply not credible anymore. So self-determination, peaceful settlements of dispute is more important than whether or not countries recognize Taiwan, because they all have relations with Taiwan. They all benefit from the current status quo, and they should therefore consider how they can contribute to maintaining it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thompson. I also have a question from Sun Yong from the ROK mission to ASEAN. As Mr. Davis and Mr. Thompson mentioned in their presentation, Taiwan is becoming a potential flashpoint. Hence, ASEAN is pushed hard to make choices. Former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir vocally argued that ASEAN has to be closer to China, not the US, because China, unlike the US and West, never invade Southeast Asia, but wishes to be recognized in the recent interview with Financial Times in 30 August. To all speakers, how do you see Mahathir's opinion, and do you think his opinion is being shared among leaders in the region? Mr. Thompson, you may give any comments.
I think I'd probably defer to Benjamin on this, but I mean, to put simply, Mahathir is entitled to his opinions and his statements. They don't necessarily reflect the current government's policies or the sentiments of most other Southeast Asian states, but he's entitled. I think he said some pretty provocative things in the past couple of weeks related to essentially internal politics and campaigning in Malaysia, but that doesn't make it policy, and I don't think it makes it relevant. I think he said some pretty provocative things about China. He says provocative things about Taiwan. He says provocative things about Singapore, and they may be best ignored.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ho?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I would agree. Given that he's not in power, notwithstanding that he's certainly an influencer in Malaysian social political circles, I would say it certainly does not reflect Malaysian official policy, so I would not lose too much sleep over it. However, I just want to point out, and this is something that I think in Southeast Asia, most of us are probably aware, that China is both a geographical and also a cultural reality. So it's not, but the fact is that of the matter is that Southeast Asian countries, we are much closer to China geographically. That does not mean we need to take Chinese positions, but geography as a way of also framing, well, for lack of a better term, to frame and dictate the kinds of interests that you ought to pursue. So in that sense, I would say that there is a certain recognition that we need to deal with or respond to relate to China in a way that, say, countries outside of Southeast Asia may view differently. And of course, the cultural element is very real because it pervades a lot of, certainly in Singapore, with 75% ethnic Chinese population. And I would say even for Indonesia, you've also got issues with regards to domestic ethnic issues. So that is something that for various reasons, the Chinese in recent times have tried to use that ethnic appeal, ethnic nationalism to generate and try to cultivate relations among ethnic Chinese diaspora in many of the capital cities in Southeast Asia, to the extent to say that because there are ethnic Chinese, therefore we need to take Beijing's line. I think that will be certainly overstretched by But I would say it does have a certain resonance among select populations in these capital cities. And also linked to that is the fact that US domestic politics for much of many Southeast Asian countries was viewed as well, it's pretty messy right now. We don't want our countries to go down that line of that mess. So what is the alternative? The Chinese comes along and say, well, we've got our authoritarian brand of politics, which has served China well for some years. So it is not just, in other words, it's not just a foreign policy issue. It has very much to do with domestic politics. And to the extent that Southeast Asian countries are resilient enough to be able to recognize the interrelated dimension of both the foreign policy of relating with China and the domestic element of Chinese presence in our own capital cities, I think that would be the crux of our future relations with China.
Thank you, Mr. Ho, for your insight. Mr. Davis, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, Malaysia obviously has Mahathir as one of the elder former prime ministers that likes to sort of make comment on current issues. We have the same with Paul Keating, who does the same. The reality is that there's only one country threatening to invade Taiwan. That's China. They're the ones that are preparing militarily for that mission. They're rapidly modernizing and expanding their military capabilities, including developing very offensive capabilities. I might add, they're also the country that is developing a breakout capability and nuclear weapons capabilities, whereas the Americans are not doing that. They're not expanding their forces. So I think it's important just to have a little bit of balance here and recognize that, like Paul Keating here in Australia, Mahathir probably sees benefit in currying favor with Beijing, but he's not formal government. He's not an official government person. Therefore, I think it's safe to dismiss his views outright and focus on the current government thinking in this regard and recognize that really, China is the one that's creating the threat here, no one else.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. We have a question from Muhammad Arif, and this question is specifically addressed to Mr. Davis. Will Australia go to war over Taiwan? And what level of operational support Australia is politically prepared to provide for the US in the event of conflict? Please, Mr. Davis.
That's a great question. Look, I think there's an ongoing discussion within Australia's strategic policy community about this specific issue, just support of Taiwan, and then under ANZUS calls on Australia to support the US. The current opposable point here is that although there's a discussion and a debate occurring within the strategic policy community, that debate has yet to filter out to the broader. I think that that's a debate we should have, but we should, not kid ourselves. At the outset of any conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan, Australia would be hit with Chinese missile attacks from the beginning. They were facilities like we want it or not, our territory from the outset. We would be hosting US forces and supporting them in their operations against Chinese operations at sea. We have to think about logistics. We have to think about sustainment. The key steps, guided weapons and export initiative defense will be under. So I don't. Yes.
Does ASEAN view that?
Well, it's what happens after the Chinese have taken Taiwan that also matters. Does China then pivot north and threaten the Ryukyus in Japan? Do they pivot south and start to be more assertive against ASEAN as a surveillance state, as in social credit systems, the lack of free press, the use of re-education camps in Xinjiang against the Uyghur peoples, the fact that the Chinese have essentially brutally suppressed democracy in Hong Kong. These are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about if you're going to put business and prosperity through dealings with Beijing ahead of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, the guns versus butter issue does matter. And it's not just about immediate prosperity or wealth or some American states. We are talking about some pretty bad, dark futures where people don't have the freedom to speak against the government, and if they try, they end up as political prisoners in a camp somewhere. So this is one of the reasons why I think Australia has jumped off the fence and is no longer prepared to try and balance trade
in the region, and whether there is need to go beyond the centrality kind of argument.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ho. As I mentioned in the beginning, that China imposed economic sanctions on more than 100 items of Taiwan products exported to China, and it's mostly agricultural products. Interestingly, China didn't touch on Taiwan's semiconductor products. Does it indicate that China comes in first?
Abilities, and it still lags behind. And that could partly be due to the lack of market forces and the heavy hand of the state, and the state dependent on Taiwan in a number of areas, not just semiconductors. I think if you look more broadly at how China conducts economic coercion against countries, it tends to target fungible items that it can replace. So whether it targets American or Australian agricultural products, to impose costs on those countries, it then increases its imports of agricultural products from other producing states, say in South America, Brazil, and Argentina, for example. You see similar issues with China's access to raw materials, right? China will block coal from some countries, but import it from others. Iron ore continue to import despite sanctions on other countries. I mean, there's a long laundry list of countries that China has imposed economic sanctions on unilaterally. Norway salmon, Philippines bananas, and it's also worth pointing out that China's economic sanctions against Taiwan products long predate Pelosi's visit as well, and it kind of underscores a dilemma for not diversifying your trade relationships. If a country becomes overly economically dependent on China, they lose their sovereignty. They get caught in a trade trap as China uses that dependency for political leverage. And that's explicit in China's economic plans and its strategy. It's explicit in its dual circulation concept, which seeks to build up its own internal economy, to build up its resiliency and reduce its dependence on other countries, while its external circulation is intended to increase the dependency of foreign countries on China. So it has a rather nefarious approach to economic relations, reducing their dependence while increasing others in a sort of mercantilist colonial way that ultimately will probably result in Southeast Asian states that become overly economic dependent on China, effectively losing their sovereignty, which is not in their interest and certainly not something those leaders want to admit. But I think it's going to happen, and it's on track to happen. Certainly for those countries that are deeply indebted to China. So trade with China is a bit of a double-edged sword because of their propensity to use it as a coercive tool and to use it towards a political end. And Southeast Asian states have to make that decision. To Professor Davis's point about sphere of influence, this is the ultimate challenge in the next few decades, is whether or not countries want to benefit from trade with China or be exploited. And I think the potential and possibility of exploitation is quite high. And I think if you look at what's going on in northern Myanmar, if you look at Cambodia, the Philippines was unsuccessful in deepening economic relations with China during the Duterte regime, and I think the current administration will probably approach it more carefully. But this is something that all ASEAN states are going to have to grapple with, and maybe ASEAN can play a role. I mean, this is an area where ASEAN could step up to support its own member countries to develop greater intra-ASEAN trade, which is surprisingly low. There's very little trade between Southeast Asian states. Primarily, they trade with China, the United States, Europe. So how Southeast Asian states can themselves develop their economy, attract partners that will help them develop their economy so they can move up the value chain and not just become a resource supplier to Beijing, is probably an area where ASEAN could develop standards, norms, share best practices, facilitate greater intra-ASEAN trade, intra-ASEAN technology transfer, common standards to basically reduce Southeast Asian states' overall dependency on China, which would then give them the autonomy that they ultimately seek.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Davis, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with Drew. I think that the parallels between China's approach to trade and perhaps, to put it bluntly, drug pushers' use of drugs to get addicts, dependent on his or supply is very clear. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a clear imperialistic hegemonic approach where China goes in with suitcases of money for elite capture and basically providing investment to countries to get them dependent on Chinese money and Chinese investment. And then as the debt goes up and they can't pay it back, China grabs infrastructure, grabs resources, it grabs ports and airports. So this is an incredibly hegemonic and imperialistic approach on the part of Beijing. The way to defeat that approach is for ASEAN to jump off the fence, to recognize what is happening and to diversify its supply lines and stop being essentially dependent on China. We're doing the same thing in Australia. We are no longer happy just to rely on China, be it for buying our resources or property or sending foreign students to our universities. We are diversifying. And the more we diversify, the less influence and coercive influence Beijing has over us. So the way to defeat China's approach is to diversify and start developing new markets, whether that's with Taiwan or with Japan or Australia or Europe. All of these are out there. You do not need to rely on China. And gradually you strip away their coercive power, economically at least, and all they're left with is brute military force, because after all, I don't see very many people sort of wanting to buy into China's Orwellian authoritarian political system of governance. So, it does kind of leave the emperor without his clothes in that sense. And I think it's really important that the ASEAN states make that leap and actually recognize, no, dependency on China is a really bad thing, and we need to stop doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. The last comment from Mr. Ho, please.
Yeah, I think Drew and Malcolm have basically said two very important points, but I just like to point out a couple of observations. One is that the Chinese economy is slowing down over the last couple of years because of their own COVID restrictions and lockdowns. The Chinese economy has taken quite a fair bit of hit, and in that respect, I'm pretty sure Southeast Asian countries are already looking beyond China to find other ways of diversifying the economic interest. So that's one. Of course, at some point when the Chinese economy eventually opens, you will have again a mad scramble to go in. But I would say that the couple of years of the COVID experience would have already, if you're a country that makes plans, you would have already looked at other alternatives. So of course, if you haven't, then well, that's just too bad. The other point is that because of the Chinese government crackdown on a lot of these big sources of wealth. Many Chinese wealthy people are starting to move their money out for fear of running into problems with the Chinese government. Certainly in Singapore, there have been quite interesting stories over the last couple of weeks showing a lot of Chinese wealth have moved into Singapore and maybe other countries as well. So I think my point basically is that the Chinese economic engine isn't going to throttle forever. At some point, it will run into structural problems, political problems, and even their own perceptions of the future of China. So in that respect, let's not be overly optimistic about the Chinese economic model as a vehicle to sustain growth in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Ho. Due to time constraints, I think we've come to the end of today's fruitful discussion. I'd like to thank our speakers, Mr. Davis, Mr. Thompson, and Mr. Ho, for sharing valuable insights on this issue and for your comments. I'd like to thank our audience as well for actively participating in the discussion. We look forward to seeing you at the Habibie Center's other events in the future, and hopefully we can have offline events in the near future when the pandemic eases. Once again, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.